Agreed to, and I call the member for Kingsford Smith.
Thanks, Speaker. This, of course, is a bill that we will be supporting, subject to the amendment that's been moved by the member for McMahon. But it really is incredible that it has taken this government so long to come to the party on offshore wind. Most developed nations were looking at developing an offshore wind industry when they have a large coastline like Australia over a decade ago. But once again, because of the intransigence and the pig-headedness of this Morrison government, we are late to the party and we are missing out on job opportunities and investment opportunities in this country. It's like being offered the opportunity to be involved in the Industrial Revolution and saying, no, we'll wait. That's exactly what this government has done. It's akin to waiting for industrialisation and saying, no, we'll be better off without it. We'll be better off without it. And that's exactly what the government has done. For 8 long years they've been in government. 8 years. And they've only just developed a plan for cutting carbon emissions and boosting renewable energy. And it's a plan that's based on existing policy announcements. There's nothing new in the plan, so-called plan that was announced this week. 8 long years. They built the Sydney Harbour Bridge in a quicker time than it's taken this government to come up with a plan for combating climate change. And when it comes to Australia's potential around offshore wind, it's one of the largest coastlines of any nation in the world. The potential is enormous, as is the potential in Australia around solar and the development of other forms of renewable energy. But this government's passed them up. This government has allowed them to go by and missed out on all of those opportunities. And with that large coastline that Australia has comes so much potential for offshore wind. We have one of the best wind resources in the world, but we're not using it. Conditions across much of the coast rival that of the North Sea, an area which has dozens of wind farms already servicing nations like Denmark and Germany. We have much more wind resources than we could ever possibly use ourselves. And recent research by Blue Economy indicates that feasible wind resources of 2,233 gigawatts of capacity off Australia's coast. Now, to put that into perspective, Speaker, Australia's entire national energy market is around 55 gigawatts, yet there's almost 2,500 potential gigawatts in offshore electricity. And this government has only just woken up to that. Well, I won't say they've woken up to it. They've known about it all the time. But they've refused to do it because they've had this pig-headed attitude to renewable energy and to action on climate change that has wasted an opportunity for this country and wasted job opportunities for Australians and the opportunity to grow our economy. There's much more potential for exporting some of that additional energy that's generated to Southeast Asia. And that's something that the rest of the world is taking advantage of already. The UK also already has the world's largest offshore wind generation capacity. And in October 2020, the UK government announced a target of 40 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. They're basically going to power every home in the United Kingdom through offshore wind energy. And yet Australia has no projects at the moment. There are more than 10 projects in Australia that have been waiting for government to bring on this legislation so that they can get on with the job. And these projects have massive capability. Star of the Sea off Gippsland, when complete, will produce enough energy to cover 20% of Victoria's current energy needs. One single turn of an offshore wind turbine can provide as much energy as a whole day's worth of rooftop solar. And these turbines can turn 15 times each minute. Offshore wind turbines are bigger than onshore and therefore have much more generation capacity. Some of the best wind resources are located just off the coast of regions that have powered Australia and Australian industry for generations. Gippsland, Latrobe, Newcastle, the Hunter Valley, Illawarra, Gladstone and Central Queensland. These regions have strong electricity grid infrastructure. They have the ports, the railways, and most importantly, the populations for new energy and a new industry. And most of these proposals are situated near traditional energy regions due to their strong connections to the electricity grid and other advantages. It is in these communities that workers have the most to gain from a thriving offshore wind industry. And it's not just the energy that's created that will benefit, it's jobs as well. The turbines, of course, need maintenance, and there's a network of ships and ports required for that maintenance. 26,000 people already work in the offshore wind industry in the UK, and another 70,000 will be added to that by 2026. OceanX is looking at spending $31 billion to build 7.5 gigawatts worth of offshore wind and significantly upgrade ports. Green Energy Partners have two projects that they're looking at to start exploratory work off the Illawarra and Newcastle coastlines. And they want to use Port Kembla as a construction hub. Port Kembla, an industry that's been a traditionally based industry. If you talk about the Industrial Revolution, you look no further than Port Kembla. It's an industry where people are thinking about the future of steel production, of coal mining in that area, and looking to the future. Well, here's an example of something that provides a bridge to the future, an opportunity for manufacturing of this industry within Port Kembla and the servicing through the port of the industry as well, creating jobs that are sustainable into the future for people living within that community. So this bill establishes a regulatory framework for electricity infrastructure in the Commonwealth offshore area, and that's beyond the 3 nautical mile limit. The bill allows for the construction, installation and commissioning, the operation, maintenance and decommissioning of offshore wind and electricity infrastructure. And around the world there's more than 35 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity now in operation, and that's expected to rise to 80 gigawatts by 2030. By comparison, Australia's entire market is at 55 gigawatts. There are more than a dozen offshore wind proposals in Australia, and these promise enormous capacity and tens of thousands of jobs. And importantly, as I mentioned, these proposals are alongside traditional energy industries and regions. There are some issues associated with this that need to be dealt with through the regulatory framework. And Labor's been campaigning for many years now for the government to fix those issues with that regulatory framework. It's regrettable that the benefits to be gained have been delayed by the government. It had promised that the legislative settings and frameworks aim to be in place and operational by mid-2021. Yet they didn't deliver once again. And this bill's major provisions will allow the Energy Minister to declare a certain area as suitable for offshore electricity infrastructure, to establishing a licensing regime for offshore electricity activities, requiring, importantly, developers to pay bonds to cover the estimated cost of decommissioning their infrastructure. And this is important given the recent difficulties with the Northern Endeavour oil facility. Require management plans for each project covering environmental management, work health and safety, infrastructure integrity, emergency management, consultation and financial security. Designate the National Offshore Petroleum Titles Administrator, or NOPTA, as the Register of Licensing Schemes, and the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Authority, or NOPSEMA, as the regulator of offshore electricity infrastructure, and provide both NOPTA and NOPSEMA with compliance and enforcement powers to carry out these functions. So these are important regulatory changes that this bill brings into operation. And the second bill, the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Regulatory Levies Bill, provides for the cost of NOPTA and NOPSEMA's new functions to be recovered from industry, consistent with current arrangements for offshore oil and gas. So this is a plan that is supported but is a long time overdue. When you think about it, it's, given the size of the Australian coastline and the fact that we are an island, it's almost criminal that this government hasn't thought of this and introduced these regulatory changes before, because the industry has been there. The demand for this has been there. The innovation is there. The investment is there. The job opportunities are there. The only thing that hasn't been there is the willingness from the Morrison government to implement it. And that's because, as we've seen this week, there is still a group of individuals, predominantly in the National Party, but many in the Liberals as well, that don't believe that climate change is real, unfortunately. They don't believe that it is happening. And they have held up the development of what could have been one of the most important and largest renewable energy industries in the world, with unlimited potential for investment, for technology advancement and for job creation, held up by a rump of a handful of people that don't believe in climate change and continue to think that we can continue with outdated, old, polluting industries well into the next 20 or 30 years without having to make any changes. And that is such a backward and a missed opportunity for not only our country, but importantly for the regions, as I mentioned and outlined, where these jobs will be created in the future. So thankfully the government has finally come to the party, but this isn't enough. This alone won't help get us to net zero by 2050. What's needed is a fair income commitment to ensuring that there are measures in place not only to reduce pollution amongst heavy emitters, but also to encourage the uptake of electric vehicles, the development of a hydrogen industry in this country, the development of solar farms, the exporting of the energy that's generated through solar and wind farms. The opportunities are boundless. They are boundless, yet they've been stifled by this government. And hopefully this Act and what's been announced this week will make them wake up that it is now time to put aside the climate wars. It is now time to stop weaponising climate change in election campaigns. It is now time to do what's in the interests of our nation, in particular our kids' future, and provide these opportunities that renewable energy projects like those that will come as a result of this regulation will bring.